everyone. I'm Eli Dourado from the Center for Growth and Opportunity, and here with a great panel of friends. We just wrapped up 2 days of amazing discussions with incredible people at an event where we partnered with Prime Movers Lab, which was a great experience. We really framed the event around abundance, and I think one of the takeaways from our event is that a lot of abundance is possible. And some of the barriers are technical and scientific, but others are policy and cultural barriers. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. With me here is Dr. Liza Reed from the Niskanen Center, Gaetano Crupi from Prime Movers Lab, and Alec Stapp from the Institute for Progress. So I'm just going to kick it off with Liza. Liza, the grid was very controversial in our discussions in the last couple days. So are we gonna have to move a lot of electrons, or are we not gonna have to move a lot of electrons around the country?
So I'm firmly of the belief that we are going to have to move a lot of electrons around the country, and also that we should want to move a lot of electrons around the country. And you know, when you talk about distance, basically we're looking at a spectrum of something from what is often called microgrids, right, where you're making all of your energy locally, all your electrons locally, and moving them very short distances, to this idea of a macro grid, where you have an entire interconnected, I'm using a US-focused perspective here, an entire interconnected grid, and you can move power from anywhere you want to anywhere you want. And transmission, to your point about policy, building those macro grids, building those high power lines is currently very difficult. Like, that is a policy challenge. And so I think when folks start diving into that policy challenge, they think, well, maybe we just shouldn't do it, and we should go with a microgrid. And I have two things to say on that. One is they're not actually in competition, right? They're on a spectrum in terms of size, but they are partners together, right? Macrogrids, high voltage transmission, like all that power, is really helpful in heat waves, in cold snaps. Microgrids are really helpful in hurricanes, right? There's times when you need more power, and there's times when you just need like little infrastructure, right? So they're complements to each other. And the microgrid only kind of perspective, I think, is a little bit driven by a scarcity mindset, right? Where the macrogrid is moving all the power all the places. The microgrid is in a very small location. It's a very small amount of energy. You know, and folks, I think it was Austin was saying that, you know, we'll see industry moving off of the grid, right? Industries that on the grid is going to move off the grid, but then you can't grow. Right? If you are maintaining your own energy, you are now the limitation of your own growth, which sounds really good until you need to make more energy, right? And so I think that's where we'll see, I don't think we're going to see a mass defection from the grid. I think what we're going to see is the grid continuing to evolve, right, and how we think about it and use it. But that transmission is still going to be essential for abundance.
And what do we need to do to build out the grid that we need?
Well, we need policy. We need a lot of policy changes. Actually, we need exactly one policy change. It's very simple. We need one policy change, which is the grid is currently built at a state-by-state level, and there are some lines that aren't a state impact. They are a multi-state impact. High-capacity transmission lines are a multi-state benefit, and so that is like quite literally why we have federalism in the federal government, right? So those are things that need to shift to a federal approval as opposed to a local approval. And then there's some technology opportunities too, right? High voltage direct current, there's a whole kind of semiconductor, high power semiconductor play here that would be really beneficial for cost.
Maybe to give people a flavor of the conversation we've been having over the last couple of days, to play devil's advocate, not necessarily my position, but I think Casey Hanmer from Terraform Industries expressed this most strongly during our back and forth on the grid, which is that if you're bullish on solar in particular and converting solar energy into liquid fuels or any other type of energy storage really, because the macro grid and building interregional transmission, the longer those transmission lines are, the more expensive it is, the longer it takes, the more jurisdictions you need to go through, the harder the problem is to build. And that's also where you get your biggest benefits, right? Because you're trying to move solar and wind energy from where it's produced to where the demand is. And it's highly correlated with geography. And so to actually get across regions where the weather isn't correlated at any point in time, you need the longest distance, most expensive transmission. And to Casey's point, he said that if we just are very bullish on the cost curves for solar and the cost curves for energy storage or converting that electricity into liquid fuels and then using the existing fossil fuel infrastructure, then maybe sooner than we think, it won't be cost effective to keep building out transmission, and we won't need as much as some projections show. And so that was a really fun conversation because the implications are huge in terms of how we should be prioritizing transmission over other things. I'm currently of the abundance mindset of let's build more transmission and invest in the solar, but it's a fun debate to have.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the things around energy is humans are going to find ways to use the energy. So it's not going to be at a point where we. I agree with you. We have to do both. It's not going. We're never going to reach a point in civilization when the planet's like, I'm satisfied. This is a great dinner. I'm skipping dessert. No more energy. Like we are going to always find uses for more and more energy. So I do think in the multiple choice, it's not A, B, it's A and B. Mm-hmm. We should do both of them.
Exactly. Yeah. I think maybe just to add on to that, I think something that was revelatory for me is I think at a macro level, we'll always find new uses for energy, but I'm also trying to think of which use cases we might tap out on and then develop new use cases for. I think Ramez mentioned at the conference that like if you look at household energy usage, for certain things like your light fixtures, people already just using as much light as they want to use, and we're kind of tapped out on that. And so making energy cheaper wouldn't cause people to increase the amount of light used in their home. And so I'm just thinking about which use cases are we close to being tapped out on, even if we had energy too cheap to meter. But I agree with you at the macro level, we're going to find new uses for it, just totally new use cases.
Yeah.
Alec, one of the things we talked about in the past couple days was a mega project idea for water. Mm-hmm. And what do you think, so tell us about that, and then also, like, what do you think the policy obstacles would be? Or like, what if we actually tried to build it, what would happen?
Yeah, it's referring to the desalination. Yeah, so I think, as most people here know, I'm sure, we are facing a drought in the Southwest. The Colorado River is at much lower levels than it has been previously. The Colorado River needs to support a large number of people in the Southwest, both for agriculture and residential use. And so an obvious solution is when you live near a big ocean, is if we could get desalination plants on the coast, that could be an effective way of getting clean water for people. As Gaetano mentioned, in Israel, this is the reality currently. This is not some science fiction project. But really, this quickly runs into a policy problem even more than a technological problem, in my opinion, because the permitting to build the plant in the first place and then pipe the water across multiple states to where the droughts are the worst is a huge barrier. And I think this is where I like to think of our current American system of government as a vetocracy, where we have many different veto points at the local, state, and federal level for any kind of mega project you want to solve. And so I run a think tank in Washington, D.C. We think about federal policy, but I'm also often thinking about, can we preempt state and local to remove as many of those veto points as possible for major projects that you can think of as in the national interest? These are strategic projects of like, drought is a problem for multiple states. It's a regional and national problem. And I think that's where we need to be really ambitious on permitting reform, because kind of, as Eli always prods me to think, like, needling around the edges of this problem is not going to solve it. You have to recognize how big of a problem it is in totality.
Yeah, and one thing also that on the desal project, but that was very poignant, but also zooming out to a lot of projects, is that when we think about breakthrough science, in our brain sometimes it's a scientist tinkering with something and causing an amazing thing that we've never thought about. But when it comes to a lot of things around grid, around desal, there's two things. The breakthrough science happened, but it just happened a couple decades ago. And so we should amortize that scientist who did that a long time ago to just do the things we know that work. That's number one. And number two is that breakthrough science can also be cost reduction, right? And and those are the unsung heroes of technology, are the ones that go down the marginal improvement curve or on those engineering improvement curves. And so when I think of grid, when I think of desal, when I think of agriculture, just bringing everyone to state of art is a lot of abundance for the planet, right? And sure, are there things that nanotechnology, quantum computing, are those things that fusion that we haven't figured out? Absolutely. But nuclear, desal, grid, I mean, just state of the art on what we have, plus cost reduction, and policy is very helpful, and regulation is very helpful on the cost reduction. That gets us really far.
And I think thinking about on the global scale, when we talk about grid on the global scale, that's another argument for microgrids, why that investment in microgrids is so important, because where we're trucking in diesel to run electricity, right, that is easy to solve, right, with a clean energy microgrid. Whereas, in the U.S. and in Europe, right, where you have different grid problems, right, that need a pair of them, and it's again all of the above, all of the abundance, if you will.
Totally, and just to add, I think for me the strongest example of what you're talking about, Gaetano, is GMOs. When we talked about just the massive productivity improvements on agricultural land that use GMOs, and it really is globally a shooting ourselves in the foot, where because in particular the European Union has banned the importation of GMO crops, many developing countries that want to export to the European market, in addition to feeding their domestic population, have banned the use of GMO seeds in the agricultural sector. And this is just literally, we're much worse at producing food now, and we know the technology, we know it works. And even in a place like the US, which has better policy on GMO crops, it's still hard to get a new trait through USDA and other regulators at the federal level. It takes many years, millions of dollars, and we're going much slower than we could. And all the evidence from the field as a whole tells us GMO crops are safe and have massive upside and benefits.
Yeah, I think to that point, it's tough to think about it coming from a technical perspective, from an investor perspective. But I really want to highlight, and we've talked about this, that the Inflation Reduction Act, that is a thing that it happened, and it just unlocks all of the science that we've already paid for, right? So there's this huge amortization and expansion of these innovations that are very quick to do globally. That if you do it, you just unlock the breakthroughs that we already have in our back pockets.
Yeah. So speaking of one thing that we already know how to do, and we had quite a robust discussion on in the sessions, nuclear power, right? So it is a significant chunk of our generation already, but and some people think we don't actually need more of it, right? Solar might be sufficient, but it hasn't really had a chance to shoot its shot in terms of being a much bigger part of the solution. So Gaetano, what do you think about that, and
yeah,
how can we solve for that?
So at Prime Movers, we look at nuclear a lot. We've done 2 investments in fusion, and we've been looking at fission for a long time. I think in the last 2 days, one of the things that I've been very cognizant is what is the VC's baton in this process? Because we can't do all of this stuff. Yeah. There's academic research, there's the government, there is the public markets later on, and we have a place in it. And right now, sometimes I feel like everyone's like, hey, VC, fission, figure this one out. And it's hard to calc out because of the costs associated with it. And we had a really good discussion about it, and I think my conclusion at the end of the day was that there might be, and this might be controversial, there might be too many approaches to nuclear for the regulators to grok, where if we had 3, then they could actually start thinking about it and putting some type of program in place with an offtake agreement or some types of subsidy to get one of these technologies to be the technology, or 2 of these technologies to be the technology, because having tons of different types of reactors is the problem with nuclear. And so right now there's a proliferation of startups that exacerbate that problem, where if you're going to get good at nuclear like the French or the South Koreans did, they picked a thing and they built the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. And the first project was way off budget, and then the second one was better. And then the third one, they're like, oh yeah, you just pour this, you got to do this thing, and it works. Yeah. And so, yeah, go ahead.
But when we think about costs in nuclear, I like to think of what are the stylized facts about this industry. And I think it is very telling that, I think that one, we know nuclear is safe. We know that we have in the past produced new nuclear power plants in a cost-effective manner. But right now, in recent years, there's no single country in the world that's getting more cost-effective at nuclear. The French haven't been good at it in many years, if not decades. Just in the last decade, the South Koreans also stopped moving down the cost curve and have had massive problems with corruption in their state-affiliated nuclear power industry. And so I take a step back and I think, okay, is it about the technology? Is it just that, is it Gen 2 light water reactors, massive on-site production that is just even if you do it in the 70s and you do it over and over and over, if you're not staying in that practicing pace, that you're going to lose the ability to do it in a more cost-effective manner. So do we need to be switching to small modular reactors, something that can be produced more in a factory? But then we have Brian Potter at our event last couple of days says, even the small ones that are produced for the nuclear subs from the military, those don't seem to be getting cheaper either. And so is there a deeper problem going on here? And in general, I think this is like a regulatory story, but I always want to recognize that when there's not a country in the world that's doing the thing successfully, I take a step back and say, is there an underlying common human concern about a technology that is causing regulators in every single country to regulate technology in a certain way that leads to rising costs over time? And so when we have solar going down the cost curve exponentially, it's hard to compare those two things and be optimistic.
Yeah, and in nuclear, just real quick, I think going smaller is the way to go from a modularity perspective, but also because the use case is now a smaller town instead of oh my God, this thing is so huge, where are we going to put all of this power? So your market size increases. The second thing is that nuclear also has proliferation issues. So are you going to get a country, any country being the one to do the first one? No, absolutely not. So I do think it's going to be in kind of an allied area or a Chinese or Russian influenced area that has that. The third piece is I do think advanced nuclear and with different cooling technologies that are a little bit better might be the optimal solution. And the other one is that we take for granted, I think, in a certain way, where we're yeah, nuclear, safe, super safe, and it's clean tech. That curve has not happened in the general public yet. Yeah. And what's really interesting, and I want to extrapolate this to other things we talked about, is communities that are close to nuclear plants, sometimes they love it.
Yeah, jobs.
It's jobs. They feel safe. They feel proud. And so it's the people that don't have that visibility, and it's this amorphous thing, being oh, I don't know. I used to watch The Simpsons. Seems bad. Yeah. That's the vision of it, not people who actually know. So the more you know about nuclear, the more you're this is fine.
Totally.
And so that fourth problem, at least in America, is going to be important. And one of the things that we also talked about is that the regulator is doing kind of what the regulator was intended to do from the early 90s to now, which is the safety first approach, right, versus the energy first approach. And that is a big calcification that we're going to have to change in order to get nuclear in the United States.
I want to go back to a little bit about what Alec was saying about the economics, right? And both of you were sort of talking about the economics and can we move down this curve? And one of the things that, again, we keep saying here, because we know it's universally true, is that nuclear is clean, firm power, right? And this was something you said at the beginning of when we were talking about the grid, right? Solar prices going down. Solar is not clean, firm power. And I'm a transmission advocate, and transmission does a lot to make solar firmer. but nuclear is a good partner to that. And I think this is another case where a lot of times they're talked about in conflict with each other, right? Because if we have the nuclear, we can just do all clean, firm power, right? The heck with variable. Well, first of all, that's not how our use curves work, right? We need both. We need variable and we need that clean, firm. But also they're all going to be beneficial when we get them, right? We need, and I'm just going to be a broken record on we need all of these, but I think it's an interesting challenge with nuclear is that we don't value clean, firm power in the US, right? That is a policy barrier, that clean, firm is not a thing we have a dollar on, and so that messes with the economics of lots of things, like transmission, like nuclear, like advanced energy.
And one thing we didn't talk about in the energy session, just because I think we didn't, frankly, have enough time, given how much interest there was in debating all these points. And I know, Gaetano, you've done a deep dive on geothermal. Alec, I know you guys have released papers on geothermal. How does that fit in?
Yes.
It fits in, yes.
Let's do it.
No, I mean, clean, firm, geothermal is the other one. And when I think of these, we are in an and, we have to do all of them. But you also have to do sequencing, right? And so, for example, I'm a believer in fusion, and I think fusion is going to be great. A fusion plant's going to be massive, right? So fusion has to have transmission because you can't it powers too much, so right? And it's further away. Nuclear and geothermal, I think, are going to be things that are going to be very successful over the next 30 years. On the geothermal piece, again, irrational public sentiment around we're going to cause an earthquake, which we're not. And so that's one piece. And the second piece with geothermal is there is adoption of micro geothermal for people to help with the heating of their homes, et cetera, right? And using the earth as that source of giving them that capacity. The thing about geothermal is that right now we have to match where the geothermal is easy to access with producing it, which is like Yellowstone, which you know what I mean, like and national parks. So a lot of the technologies that we got really excited about is how do you unlock geothermal anywhere, and for that you have to just drill deeper. So where we got to is that geothermal really is a drilling tech a problem, but we're super excited about it. I'd love to hear your opinion.
And just to follow on that, I think part of the reason I'm so excited about geothermal as a drilling tech is there's such a clear transition from oil and natural gas drilling, where we can use a lot of the same human capital, so talent developed over time. Austin Vernon was at the last conversation for the last few days, and he's an expert in a lot of this drilling technology and talking about how much of it is transferable from fossil fuel industry to the geothermal industry, and in addition to equipment. And so a lot of the industry in Texas could move over from like right there drilling for oil and natural gas to geothermal. And I think just to preview, I'm sure we're going to talk about permitting reform at the federal level a bit more in this conversation, but I think geothermal is a perfect example where the regulatory rules we apply, especially during environmental review, to geothermal is a much higher standard than we use for fossil fuels. So for example, if you want to drill for fossil fuels on federal land, if you have a lease on federal land, you get a categorical exclusion for certain stages of the process from the National Environmental Policy Act, which saves you a ton of time, money, and increases the certainty that you're actually able to deliver on your project. Geothermal explicitly does not receive that same categorical exclusion. And so a big part of what our think tank is doing on permitting reform is making the argument that we should just treat clean energy sources as good or better than we already treat fossil fuel sources of energy. And I know, Liza, I'm sure we can talk about that on transmission and natural gas pipelines, but there's a lot there of just like, the system currently works a lot better for fossil fuel infrastructure, but we've already built most of that. The stuff we need to build is clean energy, and so we make sure that the permitting system should align with our goals for the future.
If I may, I think this is an interesting connection back to the safety conversation that you raised earlier, right? That these are all seen as different things, when in fact there's so many overlaps that suggest we know a lot about the safety, right? And how we move these conversations forward towards the public comment or even the Public Utility Commission. And I'll share, I don't know how often folks have looked in Public Utility Commission dockets. I've spent some time in them. I challenge you to find a Public Utility Commission docket for a transmission line where someone is not saying, I'm afraid of this transmission line because the electrical and magnetic fields are going to do something to my health. And public utility commissions know that that is not a problem that is real, right? And so they hear this concern and they say, thank you for your input. We are building this transmission line, right? And so I think there's a mix of exactly what you're talking about here, about how that there's some public sentiment that needs to change, but there's also a lot of regulatory kind of authority, but information value here to say, like, I know you're hearing this, but you don't have to listen to that.
And I think just at a high level, I love that example, because it perfectly exemplifies for me like what state capacity is. State capacity with community input, properly defined in my opinion, is you're letting people provide input to the process, but then the person in an agency who's charged with making sure the project gets built in the real world makes the decision and moves on. It's this uncertainty where we have legal proceduralism, where anyone, and in particular well-funded interest groups, often NIMBY groups, can use our court system to block projects. And so we're kind of stripping the federal government or any layer of government with the ability to affirmatively say, like, yes, this major infrastructure project is in the public interest and we're going to do it. It kind of just like sits out there indefinitely, which is a major risk for anyone trying to invest in a project.
One thing that's important up and down the abundance stack, you might say, like, from researching like basic science to startups to tech workers and so on, is immigration. And immigration is a huge priority for the CGO, for the Scannon Center, for the Institute for Progress. What do you guys think about that, and like the role of, obviously it's a law, so how can we get more immigration to support abundance?
happy to tackle that first because this is like
Yeah.
probably the thing we've worked on the most this year at the Institute for Progress. And I think our number one specific policy goal is to get a green card cap exemption for STEM PhD and STEM master's degree holders. And the key thing is that we have a lot of temporary visas in the US that with better executive guidance, we could get a lot more people into the country through those temporary visa programs. And we can talk more about them if we want. But the key is that for permanent residency, the green card is the ultimate bottleneck, and those are numerically capped per year. And so if we decide as a country that it really is kind of insane that we don't just let people, highly educated people with skills in industries where we have shortages into the country on green cards, that we want to do that. And so I think we tried earlier this year in the America Competes Act. This is part of ultimately the Chips and Science Act. This is like, how does America compete with China and stay ahead on science and technology? And so that was able to pass the House of Representatives, and that's a great statement of like, now Democrats will vote for high-skilled immigration reform on its own. Ultimately didn't make it in the final bill, but at a very high level, we've seen much more success in Washington, D.C., framing immigration around national security issues and national competitiveness issues of like, if you want the U.S. to be the best in the world, making it much easier for talented people to move here who do want to move here currently to do so. And that works much better, especially with Republicans, than traditional economic arguments alone.
I want to put like so many exclamation points on what you just said. Going back to the previous panel around optimism, the reason why I'm an optimist is not because I think things are going to be easy, it's because I think humans have a huge capacity for being really smart and working really hard. And so if there was one thing, and we were asked that, if there was one thing you could do for this breakthrough science roadmap to be possible, what's the one thing you would do? And I was like, we need to make as many PhDs as possible, as quickly as possible. And America already has created, like the founding fathers have already created this crazy city on the hill pull for intellectual capital. If the United States can figure a way to just get all of the PhDs to move here, that is just fundamental prosperity for America. It affects defense, it affects abundance. It is just universally a positive.
I'll push a little bit. Obviously, I agree on the skilled worker, skilled green card. But then there's also, there's so many things that we need people to do that are skilled, right? They're highly skilled, and I'm the grid person. Guess what? I'm going to bring it back to electricity. Right? After the hurricane, I don't know if you saw these pictures on Twitter and in the news of trucks, like lines and lines of trucks, because utilities have this agreement where they loan their utility workers to areas of crisis. Right? It's actually, like, speaking of optimism, it's an incredibly beautiful thing to see, right? Like, we're doing this, we're just sending linemen and linewomen right down to Florida to help recover from the hurricane. But that is an industry that is aging, and that is that's a very special kind of expertise, right? That you get like on the job and needs like longevity, but also needs refreshing. And so I think there's a spectrum, and I think we all generally agree that there's lots of reasons that we need to expand immigration policy. And I just want to push a little bit on things that PhDs aren't doing that are incredibly, incredibly important for abundance of infrastructure.
So one thing we know how to solve technologically is housing, right? We know how, if we want abundant housing, we have this amazing technology for just like stacking units on top of each other. So we can put little houses on top of each other, and they're called apartment buildings.
Amazing technology.
And we had some folks at the discussions from the YIMBY movement, and they've had some pretty amazing successes lately. Do you guys want to tell us about those, and what are the lessons we can learn from those organizations?
Totally, yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. So I think this is talking most about California. The California YIMBY movement has had amazing successes at the state legislature level. And I think this is a multi-year effort. I think they've been at this fight for 5 years plus. It involves both like a public communications aspect, but most of the work was actually behind the scenes, privately working with legislators. So first, publicly, making the case that like there is a housing crisis in California and it is solvable with better policy. I think the key move they made was saying like, look, we could fight this on a municipality by municipality level, but I think the stat I heard in the conference was there are more than 500 municipalities in California. That would take way too long. And the incentives are wrong, right? When you do things at the municipal level, the NIMBYs show up to the meeting. This was earlier mentioned of like, what does community participation or input mean? It means who has the resources and time to show up and vocally oppose a project in their neighborhood or in their city. So hey, let's go to the state level where the governor and the state legislature can think about state level priorities and economic growth. And then it was a multi-year effort of trying and failing, of identifying champions in the state legislature and then helping them get into key committees where they have more authority to move the ball forward on pro-housing legislation. And I think maybe the most important piece that I've learned from them and talking to people in this movement is to be pragmatic about what kind of legislation can address most of the opposition points while maintaining most of the benefits. And so I think what you see in California, their first big win was on accessory dwelling units of just saying, hey, let's make it legal statewide for people to put an ADU in their backyard. Small win, but on the margin increases housing capacity. But now, in the last year, they've had much bigger wins, and they're doing it around targeting upzoning near public transit, near making it easier of like, hey, in commercial corridors, we're going to upzone to certain limits. And that makes it much easier for the community to say, hey, like, this is concentrated in certain areas. But from the YIMBY perspective, that's where you get the biggest benefits, is putting more housing in commercial areas and near transit. And so I think being pragmatic, persistent, working the inside game, and having great public communications of like why this is obviously a need.
Yeah, one thing that it's Breakthrough Science Conference, we talked a lot about policy. And so I think buildings and housing was a really interesting one because we broke down the stack of cost, right? And we were like, this is labor, this is materials, this is a transportation of labor. And with me, with my VC hat on, I'm trying to think of, okay, what is commercially viable for us to invest in? And what are other areas where I'm going to be an ally of like, okay, we're material science, let's do that. Maybe there's not an investable thing, but let's try to figure out a fellowship for that. Let's like figure out how to give money towards academia. When it comes to labor automation, that's a place where I think we can invest right now and get some stuff that will have VC return. And then there's also the regulatory. And so Breakthrough is a multi-stakeholder engagement process where we each have our own piece to do. And so one of the things that was really impactful for me is really understanding where are the places that I can be an ally and where are the places where I can be a capital allocator. And we have a responsibility as VCs, not as a plug, to make good investments and good returns, because if we don't, we're not going to get money to make investments, right? And so there is a piece of this where I think understanding what our role is and having other people understand what our role is important so that we can maximize throughput of these ideas and getting them out there. And so I think what's been happening with these movements and how we can expand them across the United States, not only for housing, but I mean, desal, you're going to have to do that too, because someone's going to be next to a huge desal plant, right? Grid. We're going to have to figure out how to do that too. And so NIMBYism in general, when it comes to large infrastructure projects, is super important. And we need to build some really big shit. I mean, that is what's going to create abundance, and that's how we're going to progress. We need to get better at building big stuff.
One item that stuck out to me on the roadmap I thought was super interesting was in-space nuclear propulsion, because it's super high TRL. It's like we know how to do this basically, but on the roadmap it's like 20 years away, right? And so one thought that started circulating in my head was, how do we get agencies to be more ambitious in sort of allocating research funding, right? Like, so NASA we're not doing it because NASA doesn't want to do it yet, right? Essentially, but across energy and transmission, across other areas, like how do we get the sort of allocators of research funding to like be motivated by the abundance agenda and to be aggressive and ambitious in terms of what they want to accomplish?
It's a good question. I think someone was talking about, there has been a change. I don't know if you guys have felt the change. There's been a change over the last couple of years. And I don't know exactly what this change is, but I think the time when I started feeling this change was really around the COVID vaccine, where when we were against a wall, we just lined up, and it was like, FDA, you're on board, check. Research institutions, check. Pharma, check. Manufacturing, check. Like we just, and we not only figured out the vaccine, we mass produced the vaccine and started inoculating within 12 months. Like, it's not like, oh, we figured out the vaccine. It's we mass produced the vaccine within 12 months. We figured it out, we tested it, we mass produced it. And so it is possible. I think in regards to getting people on board, it's really figuring out, unfortunately, pain points where there are irrefutable pain points. And so in California and housing, I mean, I used to live in California. That is almost an irrefutable pain point. I think that's why California was first. Wildfires and grid. I mean, that's a place where it is an irrefutable thing. And so I think figuring out how we, unfortunately, how some of these problems are really acute, and then training ourselves to be like, oh yeah, the vaccine thing, we did that. Then, okay, California, we did that. This feels good, right? Everyone kind of agreed that this was a good idea.
Winning feels good, yeah.
Winning feels good. Everyone's happy. The stakeholders are all engaged. I think that'll build a muscle memory where we're like, hey, do you remember the A, B, and C, and D things we did? This is like that. And we kind of create momentum.
Yeah, I'll give 2 examples from the grid. One is...
Do you like the grid?
It's all right. We've been talking. One is democratization of energy, right? And one of the things that's challenging about changing the grid historically is that it's pretty divided, right? So there's a couple of different maps out there, 3 grids, 12 grids. We could talk about that for 45 minutes. But it's divided and captured, right? The utility is managing things. And the decreases in solar power, right? The availability of our own energy, of distributed energy resources, but also control over our own energy, has changed our view of what we can do with electricity. And I think the thing that's particularly important is how again, this is US-centric perspective I'm sharing here, but that is a shared experience, right? And so there are folks in Arkansas who are trying to get solar power on their roof, and their utility is not letting it connect, right? They're delaying the connection and not letting them get that value. And that creates some of these, like when these pain points come together is, oh, this is a universal experience we're having. We do have to change the way we regulate and manage these things, right? And when we think about technology from a VC angle, right, what that deployment of that two-way system looks like on rooftop solar, right? And how we can make that move faster. The other is going back to the agency question. I think we've talked quite a bit about state capacity, right, and this question of overregulation and who's responsible for what. The Office of Electricity was responsible for the grid for a really long time. We still have an Office of Electricity. It's not like a particularly inspiring name. You know what else we have? A grid deployment office. You know what they're doing? They're deploying the grid, right? And I think it's not only language, it's mission, right? It is that alignment of agencies and giving them a mission of like, you are deploying the grid. Right, Office of Electricity, that's too many things, right? That's not a mission orientation, and I think that's probably similar.
I like that.
Yeah, maybe to build on both of these and maybe combine them in a way. I think because learning from the success of Operation Warp Speed is a major project for our think tank in terms of making it more widely known exactly what we did. A lot of people know at a high level there was this big ambitious project called Operation Warp Speed. It got us the vaccines in less than a year, but that's where a lot of, at least in DC, the knowledge kind of stops. And so 1, there are great lessons to be learned here, and we want to kind of propagate those. But 2, we also want to make sure that the lessons are being applied in the right context. And I think for the thing that Eli mentioned at the beginning about in-space nuclear propulsion, I think this could be an application that works, because why did Operation Warp Speed work? Well, the science was pretty well understood, as we mentioned in the previous panel. We've been investing in mRNA vaccine research for decades at this point. We needed the urgency of the moment to align regulatory incentives and get all the players that Gaetano just mentioned on the same page of what the goal is. And it's always important to have a particular, the term is target product profile of like, how do you know when a company or an organization has delivered what you want? You have to spec it out at the beginning. Vaccines are great for this because we know what safe and effective looks like. We know what it means for the FDA to approve a drug. And then importantly, it's also about thinking of the portfolio of tools the government has, both push and pull mechanisms. So a key part of Operation Warp Speed is the government said to each company, we're going to engage in advanced purchase agreements from you. So Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, we're going to buy X 100 million doses from you so that you know there's guaranteed demand for your product. Because maybe they were confident the vaccine would work, but they didn't know when the pandemic would end. How much demand is there going to be? How many variants are there going to be? That affects a lot of uncertainty there and how quickly they'll roll out manufacturing capacity. And lastly, I'll just say the push incentives matter a lot, the direct subsidies for small and medium-sized players. So Pfizer was probably always going to give it a shot and try to develop a vaccine. But a smaller company like Moderna that had never delivered a product to market, for them to take risks on building manufacturing capacity prior to getting approval would have been prohibitive. And so the government directly subsidizing and taking some of the risk off their plate enabled more competitors to go for the moonshot of getting a vaccine quickly.
I love what you said there, because when we think of that in terms of startups, and a lot of our in deep tech, you're touching regulation. Like, there's just no way about it, right? The government is part of the business case and risk mitigation. One of the things that's really important is that, yes, government grants are great, and that kind of gets you there. Offtake agreements and purchase orders from the government as a tactic is incredible, because that allows you to introduce debt, financing, and all of these cheaper parts of the capital stack into your business model. And so now you can get a bank loan, because if I do this, the government is going to give me this. I have an offtake agreement, and you can start financing factories. And so I do think that the government, not thinking just in handout, but like, well, if you do this, I'll buy it from you. That's a good. That is such a positive entrepreneurial step for the government to be, and the government is a big customer. It's the biggest customer, right? And so I do think that type of policy is really exciting for deep tech companies, because they have their first customer, they can get to scale, and it's good for everyone.
So a couple of the things we talked about already, in NEPA, citing, immigration, are actually like live issues in Congress, and we're getting close on time here. So let's do this kind of quickly. But and Alec already covered like sort of the state of play in Congress on immigration. So on NEPA reform and on citing, are you guys optimistic or pessimistic? Just kind of quickly.
I'm optimistic. I think this is just such an incredible time for permitting policy. There is more than one bill out there. I actually think there are three, technically, possibly a fourth. I heard a fourth one was just introduced in the House. That's the most movement we've seen, and actually getting legislative language is such an important first step, because then you can fight over the language, right? If you're still in the rooms just talking about what could or should be in there, that's so different than finally being able to say, okay, how does this work? How does this work? How do they compare? And let the actual politics happen, right? And I think that's sort of the stage we're at. And I guess I'm on camera saying I'm optimistic about politics working. I guess that's my stance right now. But
Amazing.
I am. I mean, I just think there's just so much has happened, and there's so much critical ideas written down in legislative language right now.
I'm with you. I agree. I'm optimistic too. And I think maybe for anyone who's been following this debate from afar, maybe this is surprising to hear that the DC policy people are optimistic, because in the news you might have heard that the deal died in September, and that progressives like Bernie Sanders had said he would not vote. He would vote to shut down the government instead of voting for this permitting reform deal that Senator Manchin had wanted as part of his vote for the Inflation Reduction Act that got us nearly $400 billion in new climate spending. And then Republicans, they were pissed at the Inflation Reduction Act. They have some quibbles around some of the transmission stuff, but at the end of the day, they did not want to give Democrats another bipartisan win right before the midterm elections. So you're hearing a lot of conflict and acrimony out of DC, and you might think that, oh, that permitting reform thing is dead. But what this situation shows us is there's still opportunity in the lame duck post-midterms. To Liza's point, we have real legislation. People are engaged in negotiations behind the scene. And you have the most important thing, which is a commitment from the President of the United States, the majority leader in the Senate, and the Speaker of the House. They committed to Senator Manchin that they would get a vote on this deal this year. And so you also have the swing senator, of course, in the Senate, and Senator Manchin. And so key players want to do this. It makes sense from a center-right perspective that Republicans in general prefer deregulation, and a lot of permitting reform can be framed as deregulation. And so, during the lame duck, either in the defense bill or the annual appropriations bill, can we find 10 to 15 Senate Republicans to vote for this deal, or not actively block it? I'm reasonably optimistic.
And one thing that also happened over the last 2 days is, I was talking to Eli about this. I think the folks at the conference were probably 50-50 split. Like, it was a pretty even thing. And when you're talking about 30-year progress, everyone agrees, hey, water, good, we're all good? Yeah, water, yeah. Energy, good, yeah. So these are all things that we can agree on. Like, if you're liberal or conservative, like nuclear, both sides can pretty much agree on it, like without any even raising an eyebrow. And so there's just so much stuff in our fields that I think we can figure out a way to get through.
I have to underscore transmission here that I also think finally getting the bill text has given us an opportunity to talk about transmission more broadly, right? And to hear the concerns that are coming from utilities, that are coming from states saying, well, this is what we have done, and be able to engage in conversations that transmission is good for everyone, right? Transmission is resilience. Transmission would have kept the lights on in Texas. Transmission did keep the lights on in California, right? And that these are really, truly are bipartisan.
I'm getting a signal here that I think we have a question from the audience.
A question from the online audience asking about China's planning to build 150 nuclear reactors over the next 15 years. General thoughts on just how they kind of move down the cost curve?
China's really good at moving down cost curves. I think that's their thing.
Yeah.
So number one, when they decide to do something, they do it. They fall in line. So in terms of regulatory time, and that's not there. Access to capital, government decides it's going to do something, it's just going to do it. They can build a bunch of them simultaneously, and they can learn from those costs. And from an environmental concern, I mean, this is one of the reasons why all the lithium and rare earth minerals are refined in China. They don't have all the rules that we have around how you're going to do the things that you're going to do. And so if they want to do it, they're going to do it. I think the thing that we also need to highlight on China's nuclear power plant expansion is that it is intertwined with their geopolitical policy of projecting power. And so China's building nuclear reactors in the United Kingdom, right? Africa, across, they're trying Southeast Asia. This is a thing where I do think at a certain point, the United States will have to figure out, like, okay, it's China's going to build the power plant and infrastructure for this country, or we should. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to say that there's a proxy situation here, but they are operating in a vacuum where people want power and they're going to build it for them. And if you get a foreign country controlling your energy supply in country, does not sound like a good idea.
Do we have any recent examples of a foreign country controlling energy supplies into other countries?
Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
So in a certain way, I do think a lot of deep tech policy and science policy is, unfortunately, at this point, defense policy. And there's also tactical reasons to frame it that way, as you mentioned. But I think this is an area that we really need to investigate. We really need to get good at building fission reactors, because the Chinese are, and they're going to use that for projection of power across the world. And I don't think that's something that is in our best interest.
Are there any other energy technologies that China is building?
I would thank you, Eli. China built thousands of miles of electricity transmission, right? They got good at electricity transmission. They got good at high voltage direct current. So China had a couple of systems built by Siemens and ABB, right, who are the big players in this space, and then suddenly China knew how to build HVDC, right? And then they won a line in Europe. It's the exact same pathway, right? Siemens and ABB are right there, and that HVDC line and station, that contract was won by China State Grid. Mm-hmm. I mean, it is happening everywhere.
Maybe I'll just add this at a very high level if we're trying to predict how likely China is to succeed in nuclear. And this is really just stealing ideas from Dan Wang, who's a China analyst and lived in China for the last 5 years. But he's trying to think categorically about which technologies China has been very good at in recent years and where it's struggled. And so it's been extremely good at solar and batteries, but it's struggled at wide-body aircraft, advanced semiconductor manufacturing, and it seems like they maybe have figured out mRNA technology, but maybe not, to be determined. And Dan's thesis is that what wide-body airplane manufacturing and advanced semiconductors, the property they share is that you're trying to integrate multiple cutting-edge scientific fields together in a way that we don't even fully understand why it works or when it doesn't. And then in solar and batteries, these are more manufacturing challenges. They require tacit knowledge. These are more engineering problems. And so if I'm thinking about it in these terms of categories, it's like, okay, which type is nuclear closer to? which types of nuclear technology they're going for. If they're going for previous generations that we really understand in this kind of copy-paste model, then I'm pretty optimistic they're going to figure out the engineering challenges.
They're going to do water-cooled fission check.
But if it was like, oh, if they were saying like we want to do breakthroughs in advanced nuclear like SMRs, I would be like, oh, maybe I'm a little less certain. But if it's an engineering problem, they're going to figure it out.
I think that's super accurate. Yeah. I think the strengths there are around marshaling resources, coordination, and copy and paste. Now they are getting better at the other stuff too, but I think that's accurate.
I think we have another question from the audience.
Another online question: do we have the right process in place where we feel comfortable that the $300 billion or so in the Inflation Reduction Bill will be allocated and spent in the right places? A lot of hope seems centered around spending to create a multiplier effect. Thoughts?
Are we subsidizing demand and restricting supply?
The absolute worst thing. I hate it. And so the way we could unlock supply is with permitting reform. I'll let Liza talk about the exact things we need for transmission to give it similar authority of how we site natural gas pipelines currently. But I think, we need to build lots of new infrastructure, and these are national level priorities. And so if we don't actually fix permitting reform, and even if we get the Manchin bill, we'll still need more reform in the future. Maybe I'll just do one quick riff on what I think the key barriers are from environmental review. And I think it's really about uncertainty for projects. We touched on this a little bit before. But it's in the US, we have an adversarial legal system. And environmental reviews are about procedure and how comprehensively you've documented the potential environmental impact of a project. And it's always possible to be more comprehensive, right? So these documents become thousands of pages, take years and years, and then they're litigated in the courts in the future. And I really think it's that judicial uncertainty of, will a court issue a preliminary injunction against my project before I break ground? Will I ever get to complete it? Is the real barrier towards major investments in infrastructure. And so the current Manchin bill has shot clocks on how long reviews can take. It has limitations on how long you have to file a lawsuit. But the real thing it's lacking is a time limit on how long courts can have the authority to issue injunctions against projects. We need to have a firm limit that provides certainty to developers with regard to the environmental review process.
Jumping in on this one, I think when the government gives you money to do something, there are problems around that. You saw that in Puerto Rico after the hurricane, where it just gave money for people to do things. If the government said instead, I will pay for the electricity that you generate when you put the lines back up, that's better. Because you have to do the thing, right? And you're going to pay for the thing. And you can do it with more certainty because you have a buyer on the other side that you trust. And so one example for the Inflation Reduction Act that has been very beneficial, I think, is around carbon capture, where what it's fundamentally changed is the project financing and the ability and willingness of people to put money into the thing, because say, like, if you do the thing, I will buy the thing. And so that, I think, reduces the incentives for corruption. It reduces the incentives for the companies wasting the government's money. It actually does the opposite. They want to be as efficient as possible to get to the place where the government is then going to give them a lot of cash for the thing that they want to pay for. And the multiplier effect, just to highlight this, is that if you change something at the unit economic basis by a couple cents or a couple dollars, for the government it's not that big a deal, but oh my God, like you just went from red to black. And so in a discounted cash flow model, it's a crazy, you start industries that way. And so I think those, I'm really excited about policies that are around offtake agreements and purchasing.
Yeah, I would agree. Going back to the previous infrastructure investment was the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA, back in November, and it did that for transmission. It's a very small pot of money, but it did create the first opportunity for the federal government to buy capacity in a transmission line. Right, you build it, and we are already there. Right, which is exactly lines up with what you said, but just needs to be expanded. The other thing I want to kind of connect a couple of dots on in my head, and by the way, I love it when other people talk about transmission permitting because it means I've done my job. Everyone should know. You were talking about that YIMBY timeline, right, and that it started with ADUs, right, and then expanded. And I think about that when we think about clean energy deployment, right? That's why I told the rooftop solar story, right? We've got to be able to show people that explicit value. But the other thing that was in IRA, without getting like too weedy in the tax policy, is that now clean energy tax credits are available for co-ops and munis, right, who have always been able to own coal and have not been able to own wind and solar because of the complications of tax policy, right? That is a huge game changer, right? So it does unlock a lot of things. We still need to unlock transmission and permitting, but there's a lot of kind of ownership and mindset shifting that I think really can happen from some of the ticky-tacky things too.
Something it's just deleting a sentence or adding a sentence. And for things that we want to do in 30 years, putting those things now, it's not controversial. Like there are certain things that people are not going to understand in the general public are like, oh, this paragraph, I don't know what that is. And you're like, oh yeah, that paragraph, that's a good paragraph. That paragraph is gonna make a bunch of cool stuff happen.
Well, and I think the clarity, right, one of the challenges with NEPA is that it's a pretty vague statute, right? There's like a good lesson on good policy is very clear on what we're doing.
So we're about at time. I'm gonna pull a Mez and what he did on the last panel and give you each 1 to 2 sentences if you want to close us out.
I would say I'm an optimist working in DC, which people are often surprised at given the gridlock and in conflict there. But I would say, one, just look at how many major pieces of legislation have been passed this year. There's a lot of new money coming into the system. To Eli's point, we should now think about how do we stop restricting supply and actually expand supply. So now is the time for regulatory reform. And I'm optimistic those things can happen in the lame duck. But at a bigger level, the way we think about policy is that the US government is so powerful, spends so much money, regulates our most important industries, that even if you have a small chance of succeeding and changing policy, the benefits of that are enormous. So we always try to think in terms of expected value of if we have a 5% chance of changing this policy in the next 6 months, if it's a major policy like STEM immigration, for example, we're going to take that shot. And if it doesn't work out in this time period, we're going to try again in the next 6 months and again in the future until it breaks through, because there are certain policies like immigration where it's inevitable, like it's such an obvious win, it's going to happen. And so it's our job as people working in policy to bring that future closer to the present.
Gaetano.
I think my main takeaway is I'm an optimist. If you're a VC, you just have to be an optimist. But I'm more of an optimist after these last 2 days. I think it's an incredibly exciting time to be alive. I think we're going to see so much change. The New York Times wrote this morning around climate change, being like, hey, we're doing a good job. I'm like, when does the New York Times when does the New York Times have a positive story? You know what I mean, around climate? So I think that makes me want to double down on the things that I'm doing. And around energy, manufacturing, agriculture, I think there's tons of low-hanging fruit, and I'm reinvigorated to keep doing what I'm doing.
Liza, take us home.
Tripling down on optimism, definitely an optimist. I think taking a different tack, I think one of the things that we talked about a little bit on this panel and over the past couple of days is that question of like national security. And I think there's lots of ways that we've made energy really like salient to folks. And clean energy, right, and energy that we can make here is one of those, right? It's natural gas, but it's also, right, I mean, it is solar, it is wind, it's geothermal, and the transmission moves that around, right? And these are all things that make us safer and secure and more able to grow and be abundant. And I think that's a message that is devoid of politics, quite frankly.
All right, well, thank you guys, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks, Eli.